Okay, so welcome everybody to our 40th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. We've been running weekly for the best part of the COVID-19 pandemic, offering researchers around the world an opportunity to present their research. It's been a fantastic journey. Now that we've reached 40, we're really very much in the midlife crisis stage. But we'll try and avoid too much navel gazing and talking on and on, and instead we'll simply introduce our 40th session, which is we're really pleased it's being given by Mario Lackner, who comes to us from the Johannes Kepler Universität in Linz, in Austria, and he's presenting a paper on titled "Do Male Managers Increase Risk-Taking of Female Teams? Evidence from NCAA." Mario has about 60 minutes to present, and if in that time you can keep your microphones on mute and turn your cameras off, just in terms of bandwidth disturbances, that would be fantastic. And so without any further ado, Mario, please do take away your presentation and share your screen.
Okay, then I will take over. I hope you can all see my slides, or at least the title slide by now. So yeah, obviously, thank you for this great opportunity to present this piece of research, which is now circulated for some months or years even. And yeah, it's my second time at this format, so always a pleasure to be here and to present. This time, not so much fresh work, but at least it's based on a working paper which is out since the beginning of the year and which we have reworked quite a bit over the summer. So to get started, this is joint work with my colleague and longtime co-author René Böheim and one of our PhD students, Christoph Freudenthaler. And what we're trying to answer here with this piece of empirical research is the question whether the gender of the manager actually has an effect on corporate risk-taking, or to be more specific, the risk-taking of the employees at that organization or that firm in more general. In other words, we could also say we are asking the question whether risk-taking could actually be taught, in the sense that the well-documented gender gap in risk-taking could actually be undone or removed by yeah, having a different type of teacher or manager or leader of a firm, so to speak, in order to kind of increase risk-taking for certain people working at that firm. So we want to understand how the characteristics of a manager, or a CEO in other words, does drive the strategy of a firm, and obviously we also ask whether this is at least correlated or driving success in the end. We actually want to contribute to the ongoing discussion whether it's nature or nurture that is driving certain characteristics, especially the gender gaps in risk-taking, or other types of gender gaps, like the gender gap in competitiveness, or other things that scholars have analyzed over the last decades. Obviously, it also has some implications on career concerns. It has some implications on how basketball is played in the college ranks in the US, and stuff like that are interesting more particularly in the industry of sports, or college sports in particular. So here's an overview on the literature, which is also part of our main, or of one of our main contributions that we are trying to make here, is that the literature on the effect of the gender of a manager or a CEO of a firm on corporate risk-taking is very mixed. So if you look out at the evidence that's out there, then you find papers where there's actually a negative effect on corporate risk-taking if a female person or manager is deciding on what to do in terms of strategy and business decisions. Then you could find papers that actually document no effect at all, so that it's completely irrelevant what gender your CEO or top management level has. But other papers document even an increased level of risk-taking once you have a female manager. So there are also papers out there who document that the self-perception of these female managers could even be in the direction that they're describe themselves as even more risk-loving or more willing to take risk. So it's kind of interesting to see that if you look at the very interesting and very important and timely topic like this, because we, especially in Europe here, we're discussing a lot about gender quotas and stuff like that, that this question is really not conclusively answered yet, not even close to being so. So we try to have some argument in this ongoing discussion. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we try to talk a little bit about whether it's some biological differences that are driving gender gaps of risk-taking, or whether actually nurture plays a greater role there. So you kind of know the discussion that's been going on this. Specifically in sports, there's some growing evidence on this issue. So there's some evidence that there is not really too much of an effect of the gender of a head coach of a team on subsequent success. So people have looked at that in greater detail. But also if you document that there are, for example, gender differences in risk-taking, like we did in an earlier paper on a very similar approach as we do here in this paper, then typically in discussions when I presented this, there was always some kind of link or a discussion on the issue whether it's actually the coach who is driving this gender difference or whether this is decisions made by the players on the court. So whenever you talk about stuff like that, one question usually or typically is that could the coach be the driving force behind this, or is it really the players themselves? And there's also interesting paper by Hendrik Sonnabend out there, who with his co-author describes in a different institutional setting and different sport, obviously, that what he finds is that female coaches in soccer are particularly more risk-taking, in the sense that the decisions they make in terms of substitutions are more risk-related than their male counterparts. And this is a very interesting finding, because on the one hand, these are decisions that the coaches make, so it's really directly management decisions. But on the other hand, the players on the field are not involved. So typically you wouldn't discuss with your coach which player is substituted in or out. So this is a decision made by the management where there is no sub-decision, so to speak, by the players on the field or the employees, if you want. So how do we approach things here? So we collected data from the web, which is web scraped, obviously. We collected for multiple seasons in the NCAA women's and men's basketball games. So overall, we end up with over 900 team season combinations with over 6,000 games for these women teams. There's a couple of thousand team game combinations in the regular seasons. We also have data on the NCAA tournament for men and women, obviously. And you see that the majority is coming from our teams with female head coaches, and we also have female teams with male head coaches. But predominantly these head coaches are actually female in our team season combinations. In the end, what we use is play-by-play data. So we fully web scrape this play-by-play data, and in order to make this handleable, we reduce them to the throwing attempts. So we have 2-point and 3-point attempts. So I don't think I have to show you what the 2-point and 3-point attempt is. So basically, we follow earlier literature and that identify the three-point shot as the more risky version of the two shooting attempts, which actually is really also supported by what we find in terms of the statistics there. So this is just a mean preserving spread in the sense that the expected points you would get out of both actions is almost identical, but the spread is larger for the three-point attempts. So this is not something we came up with, but this is based on an earlier paper from 2013, where exactly the same strategy was used. So let's look at the development of the gender share in these head coaches that we are observing in our teams in the data. So you see it's always above 60%. So the majority of these head coaches is female. There is a slight decline, but I wouldn't make too much out of it. This could also be related to the fact that in 2008 we have fewer observations. Yeah, here are descriptives, not that interesting. If you have any questions on that, just interrupt me and I'll go back to that. So we have this data, and this data kind of gives us two options to identify risk-taking clearly over the course of a game, in the sense that we can create a dynamic in time that a game takes. So what we do here is we actually divide the game into sub-periods. So what we do is we have 4 sub-periods per half of a game. So these games don't have quarters, but half times. But we further divide this. And here, this slide really gives you in a nutshell what we find in the end, because here you see the data for the regular seasons, and here you see the data for the NCAA tournaments. And what you see immediately is that the ratio or the percentage of all attempts being three-point attempts is strikingly similar for male teams and female teams with male coaches. So there's a slight difference in regular season games, but it's almost identical for the tournament. And if you see the women's teams with female coaches, it's always substantially below the level that we find for these other two types of teams. So when we first looked at the data, we were really very much surprised that this would be that clear and that impressive almost to say over the course of these games. So this is really the result we are getting in a nutshell. So if you see that, kind of the first reaction is, is this also visible in terms of success? And if you look at that, then you would see that on the throw level success, we don't see really any differences in terms of the coach gender for the female teams. We see that the male teams are slightly better shooting the three-point attempt. We see this for both types of the phases in the seasons, but you do not really see any differences for female teams. So it could not be something that success is driving this, so that female teams with a male coach are more successful and thus more likely to have this riskier type of shot in these games. So if you look at other success descriptions here, you also see the success rates here in two-point attempts. So these are all these attempts closer to the basket. There we see that there is not really too much of a difference there in the regular season and also in the NCAA tournament. Since we have so much data and the volume is so large, we can actually identify statistically significant differences. And if there is a difference, then the success rate is maybe slightly higher for female coaches, because they are for whatever reason selected to the better teams in terms of performance. The same is true with the three-point attempts, so not much really of a difference. You could see some slight advantages here if you take all shows together for female coaches, but it's really not that much that's going on there if you pool all these attempts together and not look over time. You could also look at the tournament seeds there. That tournament seeds for the final tournament are kind of a description of how well these teams performed over the regular season in terms of seeding them into the final tournament, which ultimately should decide who is the winner of a season in NCAA women's basketball. And we see that this seed is on average lower for those female teams with female coaches, which would indicate that these teams are actually the better ones that are coached by female coaches. So once we have seen that obviously something is going on there in terms of risk taking, but not too much in terms of ultimate success in the end, we try to kind of quantify what's really going on. And we use a very simple OLS model. We include some fixed effects here. And we are interested in our coefficient beta 1, which should quantify the gender gap in risk taking in terms of the likelihood to take a risky option out of this non-risky and risky option in terms of these 2- and 3-point attempts. We try to control for whatever we have in there in terms of score difference, the minute at which this attempt is observed during the game. We try to control for the months where this game was observed. We use also season dummies there to kind of control for the growing importance of the 3-point attempt in basketball overall. And we also try to control for the strengths of the opponent by using opponent season interaction fixed effects. We also use 2 different specifications in terms of what we use on the team level information. So we try to hold ability constant as far as we can by estimating a different specification where we use team fixed effects. So we can't use team season fixed effects because there is no variation in coach gender, obviously. But we can try to hold constant ability if we assume that, like if you are competing in a certain college, that the team always is up to some certain standard of play in the years 2008 to 2015. So that's what we can do. Obviously, beta 1 would then only be identified on those teams that are changing. And if we look at the data, that's not really too much that we see there in terms of changes that are going on. So what you see here is our main results in terms of what this model yields for our 2 samples that we use. Here in columns 1 and 2, we have the regular season sample. The first column is the model without the team fixed effects, but with all other controls. And we see that the likelihood of observing a 3-point attempt during any of these attempts that we have in our data is 5.5 percentage points lower if you have a female coach compared to having a male coach. If we include the team fixed effects, this effect becomes smaller. It's slightly above 2 percentage points, but it's still negative and significant at the 1% level. So we conclude that on the subsample of teams that are actually changing over time the coach gender, the effect is smaller. It's almost half, but it's still a significant and I would say substantial and economically significant result that we get there. If we look
Mario,
at,
can I just Sebastian Odden has got a question. He's got his hand up. Sebastian, do you want to ask you a question?
Yes, I have a question. Mario, in the slide before, you said that your outcome variable is varying over I and T, so like the coach. But if I understand you right, it's the throat attempt. Each throat attempt you have as your outcome variable, right?
Yeah.
So then it's varying over a different level. So that means the indices may be a bit confusing here. But what I'm asking is if your variation is coming from the coaching level, and the coach is changing, or the gender of the coach is changing by a team game because they are within season dismissal probably. Why are you looking at each throw and not on the number of throws by game? So I mean, that is your identification variation, right? So what is the advantage of looking at each throw comparing to just doing it on a game level, maybe?
Excellent question. First, in terms of when or where first to the indices, I agree it's somewhat confusing here because I had to shorten the estimation equation here a little bit in order to make it fit on the slide. Actually, what this T should indicate is the point of time in the game where we see this attempt. Concerning the other question, we see the changes of the coaches only between seasons. So I mean, I'm not really an expert here on the history of women's basketball in the NCAA, but as far as I know and I understand the data, within season dismissals are very, very unlikely. So this should not happen too often, and we actually do not observe this in the data at all. So over the course of the season, the coach stays put, and obviously then the coach gender stays constant. So that doesn't vary. Why we use it on the observation level in terms of the individual throw is that we try to make use of all the variation that's going on in there. So we want to see different situations. We want to see different timing of the game. We want to see different opponents. We want to see different importance and implications of these games. So if we just boil it down to the game, we lose all this time and score difference component, for example. So that would not be good. So in the end, in terms of methodology, we try to tackle this by clustering our standard errors. So we do not say that all observations coming from a team game are completely independent. So we try to handle this, but we use all the information that is in there. So that's basically the reason.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, just interrupt me at any time or signal to James. I'm fine with questions at any point of time.
Oh, they're now flooding in though, Mario. You might have just opened the floodgates. We've had Bernd first and then Nathan.
Sure. Whoever wants to start. So I'm not
Bernd,
sharing.
do you want to go ahead? You were slightly ahead of Nathan. You're on mute, but there you go.
Okay, now it works. Mario, do you observe teams that replace a male head coach by a female head coach and vice versa?
Yeah, we actually do this. Yeah.
And the second question is, if a team changes its strategy, that can be due to the head coach's response to changes in the roster. I would expect that the roster turnover rate is pretty high. And therefore, if a team plays differently in season T+1 compared to T, this can be due to the fact that simply the qualities of the players are now different.
Yeah. The first question, yeah, we actually do observe these changes from one gender to the other and the other way around, obviously. To be honest, we don't really see too much of these changes. So it's if you really want to pin that down, it's below 50. So the exact number I can't remember for each type of change, so to speak. But the number of changes is really very low. So you could not really make much out of this in terms of really getting some effect heterogeneity. I do have some graphs in the paper that kind of show what's going on in the end. What we see is, at least on a descriptive level, is if you have a change from female to male, then risk-taking increases and then slightly decreases again, but stays on a higher level. And you see some pattern the other way around. Obviously, in terms of the ultimate outcome, the picture is quite blurred because you would see changes that only come by because you are having a bad season, then you change the coach, and then you obviously revert to some sort of mean that you are able to produce at, and that makes an influence. Yeah, the second point, The roster turnover is actually 0 in terms of actual turnover within the season, because these guys cannot leave. There is some turnover obviously due to injuries or dismissals of some sort. Between the season, there is obviously a lot of turnover going on. I think it's smaller here for women because these teams stay together for a longer time because of different career outlooks. But obviously, we would see these changes. That's certainly true. If you kind of want to adapt to what kind of players you have on the field, then we should actually see this. Yeah. It's kind of difficult how to handle this, but in the end, we hope that the lot of variation that we have by having so many team season combinations should balance that out a bit.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bernd. Nathan is next.
Hello, Mario. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Very interesting. And my first one, I'm Nathan Ashby from University of Texas at El Paso. My first comment is actually related to this, and it made you with the measurement, right? Because there's a lot of criticism about whether or not, right? There's a lot of things this could be measuring, and one thing I say is whether or not taking more three-point shots representing risk is conditional on the quality of the shooter. For instance, mathematically speaking, if I shoot 34% from the three-point line, but I shoot 48% for two-point shots, the two-point shot is mathematically a more risky shot for me to take because it will result in less points. So depending on my roster. And so I know you kind of addressed this, but one suggestion I think is if you could look at both the 2-point field goal percentage and the 3-point field goal percentage from the previous year, right? And you could do this. The most difficult part would be for first-year players, but I think there would be a way to adjust that, right? From high school to college, and I think that would better point that this truly is risk once you control for that, right? Because I could get a bunch of players that all of a sudden shoot the lights out, and that could do that. But if I control for that, then I can barely better attribute that to risk. And the other one is because you mentioned that there's a criticism about whether or not it's the players taking the risk or the coaches. One could also argue whether or not it's upper management, right? Is it the athletic director, right? So, right. And some of these have the same athletic directors, right? I assume you have male coaches, you have coaches from men's and women's teams, right? From the same college in some cases, right? In many cases. So I don't know if that data are possible, maybe the gender or tenure of the athletic director would also kind of point towards the risk that a coach is willing to take based on the pressures that they have.
Yeah, thanks for these 2 points. Maybe just quick replies, not to run behind in times too much. First of all, like the point you raised about the ability is certainly true. So it all depends on what my true ability is in terms of shooting the 2 or the 3 here. Obviously, what we are not able here in the data is to attribute whatever we see here to a single player. So we cannot really distinguish what player XY is shooting this attempt, but we can also only identify the team. So this gets really messy if we try to go down to the individual player level. So it's difficult to kind of control for what was going on in terms of the player level. We could do this for the teams though, which might be an idea to pursue here, to kind of look at whether we can see the teams who are doing very well in shooting the 2 versus the 3 are different here, but we cannot really do this on the player level. And in terms of the athletic director, you are completely right. So far, we don't have any information in there. We might have a look at this. I mean, it would take some time to get this information. in the end, I would assume, I mean, maybe the colleagues from the US could kind of correct me on that, but I would assume that most ADs are male, but we should have a look at that, yeah. But thanks for these comments.
Thanks, Nathan. And there's one more from Alex before you get to continue.
Okay,
Mario.
okay, yeah,
Alex.
sure.
Alex, can't hear you. You're definitely off mute though, Alex. So I think I wonder if it's a problem that you've had before.
So maybe keep your question to the end, or
yeah, or Alex, you can stick it in the chat and then Mario can address it at the end, perhaps.
Sure.
Okay, I think it's probably safe to proceed, Mario, and obviously I'll give you a bit more time at the end to make up for the time taken. So.
No problem. So if we look at some effect heterogeneity here, if we take all this pooled data and kind of look at all the variation that's going on in terms of the timing of the attempt and the score differences of the attempt, then we can look at what's going on over time in these games. And if we look at the simpler model without the fixed effects, where we use all the variation there that we have in the data, we see that we have a very, very consistent effect over time. So it doesn't really change that much over time. The difference stays almost perfectly constant over time. And the same is true if we use the fixed effect model here, identifying our gender difference on those teams that change over the years that we observe them. Again, the estimated effect is small here, but it's still significant for most time intervals of the game that we look at. If we look at the score differences, the same picture is there as with the time variation. We see that is remarkably consistent over all these score differences, like it was for timing. It's slightly different if we take the fixed effects model here. We see some score differences where the difference is not there. This could be actually hinting to what we tried to analyze in the earlier 2015 paper, where the immediate timing and score difference interaction could play a role that you kind of revert to making the decision on your own as a player, and kind of tend to, so to speak, forget what you get coached or get taught when you interact with your coach or manager. You could also interact score difference and timing by looking at 3 subsamples and further divided by the timing of the game, where we only have throwing attempts when you're trailing by more than 3 points over time, or not much going on there. We also look at 1 possession games in terms of having a score difference of -3 to +3. Also not much going on over the course of the game. And also we have substantial leads of at least 4 points or more. Also you see that what we get in terms of the point estimate of the gender gap stays almost exactly constant over time. So we wouldn't really see much going on there if we interact timing or the score difference of the game. So when we look at this first base results, then we can confirm that there is a gender gap in risk taking to be observed in these games. We interpret this as a gender gap in risk taking, and a corporate gender gap in risk taking, influenced by the gender of the coach. But now you could ask, well, in our data, we do not observe all the details that might play a role. So for example, we already had the question about the characteristics of the teams that we do not observe in terms of are there more 3-point shooters on the team, or are you a more physical team which is scoring closer to the basket, or if the athletic director plays a more prominent role in the style of play. So we try to kind of provide a robustness check by also looking at an instrument variable approach and try to get rid of these potential omitted variable bias, or if you have some sort of selection bias in the sense that, for example, male coaches could go to programs that actually prefer to take higher levels of risk. So this could be the case that you have a match between a male coach and a team that has the culture of risk-taking kind of within its DNA. So what we do here is we basically estimate our standard model that we had in the OLS and fixed effect specifications earlier, and we try to make a causal identification by instrumenting whether the coach is female or not by an instrument set, which is based on the characteristics of this university. And here is like the biggest change that we had to compare to an earlier version of our paper and the working paper version, where we changed this variable set to kind of capturing now the gender ratios in the academic body of these universities by measuring basically the ratio between female professors in terms of full professors by the enrolled female students. So how much you have gender equality here measured by the absolute amount of female students at your university. It was kind of difficult to get all this data together, but in the end we could find this for all the universities we have here in our data, all the colleges. And in the end, what we find here is that our instrumental variable is indeed kind of correlated with the gender of the head coach of these teams. So we would say that if you have a more gender equal culture at the university, this also should have some effect on the hiring policy that you have in your athletic programs as well. So obviously this is a relevant instrument. We also think that this is a valid instrument in the sense that decisions made in the academic part of the university should not really have any sort of direct effect what these players are doing on the field, in the sense of deciding at the single attempt level what actually to do by deciding between these two options that they have. If we estimate this two-stage least squares model, we get the results that are presented in this table. And what we see here is, if we look at the pooled results, we almost exactly get the same point estimate as we get in the OLS specification for the regular season. We split it up here in home and away games. We also do this in the OLS in our working paper, but you see we get the same here. Not much of a difference going on quantitatively in terms of what we estimate. For the NCAA tournament, the effect is estimated to be larger. That was also the case for the OLS, but here we get an even larger point estimate at a gender difference of, slightly above 14 percentage points. Concerning the first stage, we get exactly what we would expect, and the F-statistics is doing fine in the sense to kind of support what we find earlier, that what we find earlier is not driven by some unobserved characteristics that would bias our estimates from OLS or the fixed effects. If we look at time and score difference dynamics for these two-stage least squares estimates, then we see that obviously we estimate the effect with less precision, so it's not always statistically significant what we get, but you see there is also not much going on in terms of effect heterogeneity over time or score differences. As soon as we have at least what we think a solid argument for these gender differences in corporate risk-taking coming from the manager or coach, we immediately want to ask well, does this actually show up in success as well? So is more risk-taking actually more successful? Is it less successful? Are these teams taking more risk because they are less successful? So what's going on here in terms of success? Because it has to have some sort of effect. Is it good or a bad thing to do this? That's an obvious question. And what we find is actually that on the individual throw level, as some evidence before has suggested, we don't find anything at all. So whether you have a female or male coach does not really affect the ability to shoot the 3-point for these female teams at all. And it's really a very precise zero that we are estimating here. So this is what I mentioned before here in terms of for the changers. What we see actually is here the type of change, okay? And we have different types of outcomes where we see that in the end, you see some effects going on there, but it's really not too much we want to interpret in these results because they are really based on so few changes that we observe in the data, especially for the different types of changes. So looking at the individual throw level is not enough really to have a strong argument here. We also have to look at game level or at least some intermediate measure of success here. What we do is first we look at the success in terms of how successful are they in sub-quarters of these games. So we divide these games in 4 parts, and if you just plot the win probability for these quarters against the quartiles of risk-taking within the gender distribution of risk-taking, then you see that it's quite inconclusive from this pattern. You see that for some it's upward trending, that you have more success the more risk you are taking. But the most striking result, and this is kind of what you always get to when you look at risk-taking and some success measure, that in the end of the game, here in our last quarter, sub-quarter of these games, you see the more risk you take, the lesser successful you are. But this is not really a causal argument, but this is just a result of gambling for resurrection, right? So you're losing the game and the only chance you have to win this game is to take as much risk as anyhow possible. So if you are trailing by 10 points in the last minute, the only thing you can do is get as much points as you need, just shoot the 3-ball and hope for a miracle to get back into the game. So whenever you do something where you want to explain success by risk-taking, you have to keep this in mind. So this is a huge problem trying to identify some causal effect going from risk-taking to success at the game or sub-game level. What I try to show you here is now looking at different types of where you take risk. So if you have above median risk, then your pattern here would be 1. Basically meaning if you have a pattern of 4 zeros, then you are never within any sub-quarter of these games above median risk-taking within your gender distribution of risk-taking. And what you see for men's teams is the more ones appear in your pattern, the more successful you are in terms of the probability of winning the game overall over all these games. What's the difference between these solid markers and those hollow ones is that the hollow ones always have a 1 at the end, which is this gambling for resurrection stuff. So you see that once these teams are forced to gamble and take high risks at the end, their losing percentages, their winning percentage is always significantly lower. So that's not a surprise. That's just the same thing we showed earlier on. If you look at the same here for female teams with female coaches, you see the same pattern. The more risk-taking there is in the first 3 quarters of the game, the more success you have. It's a little bit different here for female teams with male coaches, but you also see kind of this shape as well. So if we do run some regressions on this, controlling for everything you can observe, then you see that for 3 different outcomes, point scores, net point scores, and the probability to win the sub-quarter we observe, you see that for men, the more risk you take here in these first 3 quarters, the higher is the probability. The more points you score, the higher is the probability that you win, the more net points you score. We also see the same pattern somehow for female teams with female coaches, where you also see this positive correlation of risk-taking and points, net points, and the probability to win. But we don't see this for female teams with male coaches. So we could argue that increased risk-taking for teams that are female being coached by a male coach is not as obvious as for the other types of teams here. Our final approach to kind of show if there is a link between risk-taking and success in the end would be to analyze the whole game and now simply sum up how much risk you take in all 3 sub-quarters of the game. The dependent variable is simply if you win the game, yes, equal to 1, 0 equal if you don't win it. And we estimate this for men, and we see the more risk-taking early on, the higher is the likelihood that they win the game. A very strong effect, negative effect at the end. So this is again this gambling for resurrection stuff. We see this for all other samples as well, but we see that for female teams with a female coach, it's kind of almost the same here as for the male teams, that they have this positive effect here at the beginning of the games in the first half here for the first 2 sub-quarters. There's a slight effect here for female teams with a male coach, but really not much going on here in terms of this correlation. So we could conclude taking more risk for female coaches with a male team does not really pay off in the end in terms of increasing the probability to win the games. So summing up, in the end, we hope we have a somewhat convincing argument that the gender of coaches in the NCAA women's basketball has an effect on risk-taking on the field by the players identified by the probability of shooting a 3-point versus the 2-point attempt. We try to control for everything we have in there. The effect is still there if we use team fixed effects, and we can conclude that it is a very persistent effect over time and over score differences. It's not driven by within game dynamics as we probably would have expected, also going back to earlier results in different papers that we got. We don't see any differences in terms of success on the individual throw level. So there is no difference whether they shoot more or less in terms of whether these shots are actually successful. We also don't find any role of the gender of the opposing head coach. So there is some literature out there investigating this and kind of documenting that if you have like, for example, a male coach as a female coach on the opposite, then this could also affect what you're doing in terms of risk. But this is not the case here in our data. We also try to use an IV approach to kind of tackle all these potential issues. Some of you mentioned also in the questions. We think that OLS results are at large confirmed, and we think that we are kind of safe in that department concerning that we don't have really some biased results driving what we find. In terms of overall game success, we would conclude that this increased risk-taking by female teams with a male coach is not really something that's increasing success for them. Yeah, how you want to interpret this, might be debatable, but we think that that there is some argument in terms pointing into the direction of nurture being probably more relevant than nature, as the only thing that's varying here is the coach gender, and we have only female teams with probably equally distributed abilities and also equal career concerns and stuff like that. yeah, obviously coach hiring decisions will play a role if you want to affect how the game is working out in terms of which style of play is more attractive, what kind of career concerns do you have. When you are recruited by a university, do you go to a female or male coach? If you, for example, are willing to or are good at shooting a 3-point attempt versus a 2-point attempt, for example. So this might all play a role. So I see some hands going up, which is perfect in terms of time because I'm finished. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Mario. You have indeed spotted the questions. Stefan was the most eager with his hand up first, so we go to Stefan first of all.
Thank you, James. Yes, very eager. So I have some issues here, Mario. The linchpin of this paper is to claim that taking a 3-point shot is evidence of risk taking, and that's the one. You kind of assert this at the beginning of the paper, and you never really go into a detailed justification. And I would have thought if you want to make any major claims about this, you really have to convince us that taking a 3-point shot is evidence of risk taking. I mean, Nathan made the points before about the nature of the player, which clearly is important. But the meaning of risk is my belief about what is going to happen as a consequence of my action. And clearly, the ability of the players is massively important in determining whether taking a 3-point shot is any evidence of risk taking. So I just don't see how taking a 3-point shot could in any sense be a measure of risk taking. And in terms of your results, could I find an alternative explanation? It doesn't seem, you don't really consider alternatives, but it seems to me it's not that difficult to think of an alternative explanation. There's a lot of gender bias in the United States everywhere you go, including within universities, and I should know, I work in one. And it's perfectly possible that women have fewer chances to coach good women's basketball teams, and therefore the men get selected to coach the better teams. The better teams are going to take more 3-point shots because they're more likely to succeed, because that's not risk taking as far as they're concerned. And so actually, you know, it tells us nothing about risk, but it tells us everything about bias in selection of coaches in athletic departments in the US.
Yeah, excellent questions. I mean, I agree 100%. I was very quick on the justification of the risk measure. I mean, that's perfectly fine. I mean, probably I should have showed some sort of distribution of expected outcome that we can take from the data and really kind of illustrate that it is almost a perfect measure in sense of having this mean preserving spread where you have the almost identical expected outcome, but just it varies more, the 3-point attempt. But I agree that I was first of all fairly quick on that, and the other thing we do is obviously draw on earlier literature on that. So yeah, I agree. We should improve that. In terms of alternative explanations, I agree 100%. We do this in the paper. For example, we discuss in a way what you mentioned, in the sense that there is gender stereotypes. And for example, you mentioned that the better teams are coached by male coaches. But this is not true, actually. We see it the other way around. The better teams are coached by female coaches. This is quite obvious in the data, which was surprisingly obvious for us because we would have expected it to be different. So another alternative explanation would have been to kind of say that maybe you have a different style of play that you have as a male coach, where you might have, for example, played in the NBA, or you might have aspirations to play in the NBA, and you might be favoring the 3-point attempt for whatever reason, because it's now in fashion in the NBA, in the professional ranks. But actually, we see that the ability to shoot these 3-point attempts is slightly higher for these female teams, or we don't see a difference if we really look at the regressions. So we think it's not really driven by some selection in terms of that the male coaches would be selected on teams that are better or more willing to take risk or stuff like that. At least we don't see any evidence. But yeah, that needs to be discussed, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. I realized that we skipped over Alex's question. Alex was struggling with his microphone, and he typed his question out, which was, why not use team season fixed effects, which are likely to better control for the current team's ability and compute clustered standard errors on the team level, which is what is suggested in the econometric literature.
Which is exactly what we would do if that would not fully explain our coach gender variable. So that's not an option. We cannot do this because then we cannot identify anything. So we can't really do more. Otherwise, we would obviously control for team game fixed effects, because there you can control for everything. But even team season fixed effects perfectly predict the explanatory variable. So that's not an option, unfortunately.
Okie doke. And then we had Dennis Coates had his hand up second after Stefan.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Mario. Interesting talk. You mentioned this a little bit in response to Stefan's comment about the possible difference in style from male coaches and female coaches. But I want to probe that a little bit more, because I was thinking about your point of nurture versus nature. So nurture is you're learning this activity. It seems to me that if you want to address that idea, you have to think about what we in the US would call the coaching tree. Where did this coach learn the particular strategy or approach that they took? And so, you might control for all the coaches who trained under the same head coach at some point in the past. Or you might think that different coaches have different, what we would call systems. And so it may be that my system is one which is much more of a free-flowing game, and so we get lots of quick shots and run and gun, fast break, take the quickest shot you can you're open for, or an offense that is very methodical and uses all the time they possibly can to work for the best shot possible. And it seems to me that without controlling for those sorts of characteristics, that you aren't really able to say anything about first nurture, but then the more important point about whether this is a gender difference for risk taking or not, because my ability or my willingness to take risk is also very connected to what style of game I choose my team to play.
Yeah. Excellent points. Excellent points. Also, ideally we would also like to know or understand, or at least be able to measure how long, for example, the actual player who is taking the shot is together with this coach. That would also be very interesting. I agree. This would be ideally something that we want to control for. To be really honest, it's more a data reason that we don't have it in there, because it really gets highly complicated if you want to have all these kind of networks of coaching and coaching trees that are highly relevant for what we are measuring here. So at one point we tried to get the age of these coaches, and it was highly difficult, and we kind of stopped in between, because yeah, we kind of got stuck to find all these hundreds of coaches. To get a coaching tree, I suppose is highly difficult, but we could have a look at that. I mean, to some extent, we think that our IV approach should control for a lot of things that are related to that, because you have only variation that's coming really from the, so to speak, gender equality at the academic level of a university. And I would assume that this variation should be quite exogenous to all these elements. But I agree, it would be nice to have this data. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for this comment.
And then we've got Bernd with his hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to return to your observation that the female coaches coach the better teams. So do female coaches make teams better, or do better teams hire female coaches? And the third point is, high ability female players may have a preference for colleges, the teams of which are coached by women. So you have a two-way selection phenomenon going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first point is very important, I think, because you would be interested whether it's the female coach making the team better. So from more anecdotal evidence, or from the slight evidence we get from the changers, I would say the answer is yes, but I'm afraid we could not really get the conclusive answer on that. But we could have a look whether there is some evidence, which we should actually do. And the other thing is the selection. I agree 100%. So I think that there is some selection going on, that you as a female recruit are probably more likely to go to a program where you have a female head coach. So I think that's 100% the case, at least if you think about these coaches, like visiting the recruitees and arguing them into signing at the program. That might explain this to a high degree, actually. Yeah, I think the using the team fixed effects, so identifying the effect on the changers, helps a little bit. I also think that the IV approach helps a little bit, but I think that we could look into that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Bernd. Any more questions or comments?
I mean, just to follow up. Sorry for that. So one of the difficulties, if you try to compare, for example, what male teams do and what female teams do in terms of risk taking, is that you always run into the problems of different career concerns. And if you, for example, would compare male teams and female teams in the NCAA, then there is another dimension of career concerns in terms of the complete, or the different terms of games you have. Because in the NBA, the 3-point is everything, right? It's increasing year by year by year, and it has gone to a degree where the league has kind of thought about changing this, making it less important, for example, or more difficult. So if you're playing at a men's team, then you would be willing to go to a team that's willing to coach or to take more risk in terms of making 3-point attempts. But I don't think that's the case really for these female players, because the outside options in terms of professional careers are really not even comparable to those of men. Sorry.
No, don't apologize, Mario. Nathan has got his hand up for another question.
Yes, I just have a real quick comment. I can't remember how long you said the sample went back to, but at some point the distance of the 3-point line for the men changed relative to women. So if that is within your data set, you'd want to figure out what year that took place and control for it.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, there are some changes. I don't think it's only for the men. There are also some slight changes over the years for female teams. We looked into that. We also at one point tried to set up some sort of diff and diff on that. To be honest, it didn't really change much. We were kind of surprised. There were some slight changes in terms of the likelihood to take these 3-point attempts. There's almost nothing going on in terms of success. So they adapted well to these changes. We simply tackled this by using this season dummies. So we control for that.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Any more questions? Okay, well, assuming not, thank you, Mario, for what was a very interesting talk, provoking lots of discussion. Yeah, thank you very much for that. We will return again next week, and next week we have a slightly different talk. We have Laurent Malissot of the Luxembourg Institute of Health with a talk on cushioning body mass and running biomechanics as risk factors for running injury. Sorry, a randomized trial with 800 plus recreational runners. Please do join us for that. That's a joint initiative with the S Training Network, where S stands for sport. And so that will be next week's talk. It will be at a slightly later time, starting at 3 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. GMT. And we look forward to seeing you then, and wish you all a good weekend. Please do stay safe, and we'll see you all again soon.